The earth does not shake by chance. Stand for a moment in the shoes of a Persian conscript. The year is 331 BC. The place is Gaugamela, a dust bowl in modern-day Iraq that history has marked for slaughter. You are standing in a formation that stretches for miles, a sea of linen and
Subscribe to the
bronze.
channel,
You are
like and share in the
confident.
comments
You
what
have
you know
numbers.
about these
Your
legendary
king,
warriors.
Darius,
And now,
has
let's get back to
assembled
the
a
story.
250,000 men. You have scythed chariots designed to sever legs from torsos. You have war elephants that scream like demons. But then the wind changes. It begins as a vibration in the soles of your sandals, a low-frequency hum that travels through the skeletal structure before the ear can even register it. It is a rhythmic, percussive bass note, heavier than thunder, more consistent than an earthquake. You look to the far right. The dust cloud is shifting. Emerging from the golden haze is not a disorganized mob, nor a static line of knights. It is a geometric anomaly. It is a perfect, living triangle. A wedge. At the tip of this wedge rides a man with hair like a lion's mane and eyes of different colors, one dark as night, one blue as the sky. He is not shouting orders. He is screaming in ecstasy. Behind him, 2,000 of the finest killers the ancient world has ever produced are riding knee to knee, their horses' chests heaving in unison. When they strike, it will not be a battle. It will be an amputation. This was the companion cavalry, the Hetairoi. They were the personal hammer of Alexander the Great. They were the first true shock cavalry in human history, a unit so effective, so violently efficient, that they did not just defeat armies, they dismantled empires. To understand how a small kingdom in the mountains of northern Greece conquered the known world, you must look past the phalanx. The phalanx was the shield, the Hetairoi were the sword. And this is the story of how that sword was forged, how it killed, and how it eventually turned on itself. The Forge of Souls, Recruitment, Indoctrination, and the Royal Pages. The lethality of the companion cavalry was not the product of drill sergeants or boot camps. It was the product of a masterful, multi-generational psychological experiment. In modern warfare, soldiers are recruited based on physical aptitude. In Macedonia, they were recruited based on blood, but they were kept based on loyalty. The process began with King Philip II, Alexander's father, a man of terrifying intelligence who understood that the greatest threat to a king is his own nobility. The institution of the Basilikoi Paiades. Philip instituted the Basilikoi Paiades, the royal pages. This was a stroke of Machiavellian genius. He demanded that the aristocracy of Macedonia, the fierce, independent barons of the Upper Highlands, send their adolescent sons to the royal capital, Pella. Ostensibly, this was the highest honor a family could receive. These boys, starting at age 14, would be educated in the royal palace. They would learn rhetoric, philosophy, geometry, and warfare. They would be tutored by the greatest minds of the age, including Aristotle himself. In reality, they were hostages. By holding the sons, he held the fathers by the throat. If a baron in the Licenstian mountains fought about rebelling, he remembered that his beloved son was serving wine to the king in Pella. The Brotherhood of the Wolf.
But inside the palace walls, the hostage dynamic dissolved into something far more potent, a tribal bond. These boys were not just raised near the king, they were raised with the heir. They grew up alongside Alexander. They wrestled in the palestra with him until their knuckles bled. They hunted wild boars in the marshes with him. They slept in shifts outside his door. They competed for his affection and his praise. This created a unique psychological architecture. By the time these boys turned 20 and were inducted into the companion cavalry, they were not soldiers fighting for a paycheck, nor patriots fighting for a flag. They were a band of brothers in the most literal sense. When Hephaestion, Ptolemy, Seleucus, or Clytus rode into battle, they were protecting the man they had played with as children. This eliminated the primary contagion of ancient armies, panic. Panic is infectious. When one man runs, the line breaks. But a companion would never run, because to run was to abandon his brother and his prince. This cohesion allowed them to attempt maneuvers like charging into rivers or wheeling 90 degrees in the middle of a melee that would have caused any other unit to disintegrate. The cost of entry. To be a companion was to be elite. There were approximately 1,800 to 2,000 of them at the start of the Persian campaign. They were the 1%. They owned land, they had servants, and they were expected to provide their own equipment. But money alone could not buy a place in the Wedge. You had to have the arete, virtue, excellence, and a hunger for glory that bordered on madness.
The physics of violence, the horse, the gear, and the lack of stirrups. To appreciate the sheer physical prowess of the Hetairoi, one must understand the handicap they fought with. The missing stirrup. The stirrup had not yet been invented. In medieval times, a knight was locked into his horse by a high-backed saddle and stirrups. He became a human projectile, braced against the impact. The Macedonian companion sat on a simple saddlecloth, often made of panther skin or felt, secured by a girth. He had nothing to brace his feet against. Think of the physics involved. A rider weighs 80 kilograms. His armor weighs 20 kilograms. He is moving at 35 kilometers an hour. He strikes a standing infantryman with a lance. Newton's third law dictates that the force applied to the target is applied equally back to the rider. Without stirrups, a normal rider would be launched backward off the horse's rump, shattering his spine. The Macedonian grip. To counter this, the companions developed a riding style of extreme athleticism. They did not ride on top of the horse, they rode around it. They gripped the barrel of the horse with their thighs and knees, a vice-like grip that required immense core strength. When the impact came, they did not stay rigid. They leaned into the blow, using their spinal column and the horse's momentum to absorb the shock. It was a feat of balance akin to a surfer riding a tsunami. The monster, the Thessalian horse. The vehicle for this violence was the Thessalian horse. These were not the delicate Arabians of later centuries. They were short, stocky, thick-necked beasts, resembling modern quarter horses or cob breeds. They were bred for aggression. Alexander's personal mount, Bucephalus, Oxhead, was a legendary creature. He was massive, black, with a white star on his forehead. He was reportedly a man-eater, unrideable by anyone but Alexander. These horses were weapons in their own right. In the crush of the melee, a Thessalian horse would bite the faces of enemy soldiers and kick out at shins. They were trained to ignore the smell of blood, the roar of crowds, and the screaming of camels. The existon, the double-ended death. The primary weapon of the companion was the existon. While most Greek cavalry used two short javelins, one to throw, one to stab, the Macedonians committed to the melee. The existon was a lance made of cornel cherry wood. This wood is incredibly dense. It sinks in water. The lance was long,
roughly 3.5 to 4 meters, 12 feet. This gave the companion the reach advantage over Persian swordsmen. Crucially, the existon had a spearhead on both ends. This was a stroke of practical genius. In the violence of a charge, lances break. They snap against shields or get stuck in rib cages. If the tip snapped, the companion did not draw his sword. He simply flipped the lance in his hand and used the rear spike, the sauroteur, or lizard killer, to continue the slaughter. This allowed the unit to maintain momentum without pausing to rearm. The weapon of psychology, the Boeotian helmet. Perhaps the most telling piece of equipment was the helmet. The companions did not wear the restrictive Corinthian helmet that covered the face. They wore the Boeotian helmet. It looked like a folded sun hat made of bronze. It had no visor. It had no nose guard. The face was completely exposed. Xenophon, the military theorist, recommended this for visibility, but Alexander used it for psychology. He wanted his enemies to see him. He wanted the Persian infantry to look up and see the eyes of the man killing them. He wanted them to see the frothing rage, the bared teeth, the human expression of fury. It created a connection of terror that broke the will to fight.
The geometry of slaughter, the flying wedge and the hammer and anvil. Before Philip II, cavalry warfare was clumsy. Riders fought in long lines which were easily broken, or squares which couldn't turn. Philip looked at nature. He watched the flight of cranes and swans. He looked at the shape of a thunderbolt. He invented the delta, the wedge formation. Inside the wedge, imagine a triangle made of 200 horses. The apex, at the very front, rides the Ilarkes, squadron commander. In the royal squadron, this is Alexander. The wings, echeloned back to his left and right, are the senior veterans. The center, inside the triangle, are the newer recruits. This formation was a masterpiece of geometry. 1. The piercing point. A square formation spreads the impact over a wide area. The wedge focuses the kinetic energy of 2,000 horses onto a single point. It strikes like a chisel. 2. The neurolink. In a line, a rider has to watch 20 men to keep formation. In a wedge, every rider only has to watch the man immediately in front and to the side of him. If Alexander turns his horse 45 degrees, the man behind him turns, and the man behind him turns. The entire formation ripples and turns instantly, like a school of fish. The breach. Once the tip enters the enemy line, the widening sides of the triangle force the enemy soldiers apart. They physically ripped the opposing army open from the inside out. The grand strategy, hammer and anvil. The companions were not a solo act. They were part of a combined arms meat grinder. The anvil, the Macedonian phalanx, 10,000 men holding 18-foot pikes, sarissas. They marched forward and pinned the enemy in place. The enemy infantry could not move forward against the pikes. They were fixed, stressed, and blind to their flanks. The hammer. This was the companions. Alexander would lead them to the far right, stretching the enemy line until it snapped or a gap appeared. The strike. Once the gap opened, the hammer, companions, would swing inward, smashing into the rear or flank of the enemy pinned against the anvil. The result was not just defeat, it was annihilation. The enemy was crushed between an immovable wall of pikes and an unstoppable force of cavalry.
The Red Road, the battles that broke the world. To truly understand the shock of the Hetairoi, we must witness them in the heat of their most famous raids. 1. Granicus, the suicide charge, 334 BC. The invasion of Persia began with an act of madness. The Persian army held the high bank of the Granicus River.
Conventional wisdom stated that cavalry cannot charge across a river, through mud and up a steep bank against waiting infantry. Alexander ignored wisdom. He ordered the companions to charge immediately. They plunged into the water. The scene was chaotic. The companions were fighting uphill, their horses slipping in the mud. They were outnumbered. It wasn't a tactical maneuver. It was a brawl. In the crush, Alexander's lance broke. He demanded another. A companion named Arates screamed that his was broken too. Alexander found himself face to face with Spithridates, a Persian satrap. The Persian raised a battle axe and brought it down on Alexander's head. The blow split the helmet and cut to the scalp. As the axe was raised for the killing blow, Clytus the Black, a senior companion, drove his horse forward and severed Spithridates' arm at the shoulder with a single stroke of his sword. The lesson? The companions learned that they were not invincible, but their ferocity could overcome terrain that should have been impossible. They won by sheer aggression. Issus, the decapitation strike, 333 BC. At Issus, the battlefield was narrow, cramped between the mountains and the sea. The Wedge could not maneuver easily. Alexander realized he couldn't destroy the whole army, so he decided to kill the head. He spotted King Darius III in his royal chariot in the center of the Persian line. Alexander gathered the companions and ignored the rest of the battle. They carved a straight line through the enemy infantry, aiming directly for the great king. This was a head-hunting raid. The sight of the Hetairoi, screaming, covered in gore, hacking their way through the royal guard, broke Darius's nerve. He turned his chariot and fled. When the king runs, the empire falls. The companions won by targeting the psychology of a single man. Gaugamela, the Dust and the Gap, 331 BC, the masterpiece of mounted warfare. Darius had prepared a killing field, flattening the ground for his chariots. He had 250,000 men. He had elephants. Alexander played a game of chicken. He rode the companions to the extreme right, almost off the battlefield. Darius, terrified of being outflanked, shifted his line to follow. The movement was fatal. As the Persians shifted, a seam opened between their left wing and their center, a gap, perhaps only 50 yards wide. Alexander saw it. He shouted the order. The entire wedge wheeled 90 degrees left. Elalai! The war cry of the Macedonians erupted. The companions drove into the gap like a dagger into a rib cage. They were now behind the Persian front line. The dust was so thick that history records it as a fog of war. The companions were killing by silhouette. They crashed into the immortals. They drove straight for Darius again. The shock of this charge, appearing out of the dust in the heart of the secure formation, shattered the Persian army. It remains the textbook example of the decisive blow. The Hydaspes, monsters and mud. In India, the companions faced their nightmare, war elephants. Horses are naturally terrified of elephants. The smell and the sound make them panic. Alexander could not charge the elephants directly. His horses would refuse, so the companions had to reinvent their tactics in real time. They used their speed to run circles around the lumbering beasts, slashing at their trunks and the hamstrings of the animals. It was a horror show. The elephants, maddened by pain, trampled friend and foe alike, tearing men apart with their trunks. The companions fought in a torrential monsoon rain, the mud turning to a bloody slurry. They won, but the trauma of the Hydaspes broke them. They had seen monsters and they had killed them, but they had lost the will to go further.
The cult of the spear, rituals, religion, and the symposium. How does a human mind endure this level of trauma? How do you wake up every morning for 10 years and ride into a wall of spears? The companions relied on a potent mix of mysticism, competition, and substance. The cult of Dionysus. The Greeks to the south worshipped Apollo, the god of reason, light, and order. The Macedonians were different. They were northerners. They worshipped Dionysus, the god of wine, madness, and ritual ecstasy. They believed in Enthus, literally the god within, the root of the word enthusiasm. They believed that through wine and bloodlust they could be possessed by the god. In battle, a companion was not thinking, he was channeling a divine fury. This religious trance allowed them to ignore pain and suppress the survival instinct. The symposium, drinking as war. The center of companion life was not the drill square, but the symposium. These were not civilized dinner parties. They were competitive drinking bouts. The Macedonians drank their wine unmixed, neat, which the Athenians considered barbaric. They drank until they passed out or fought. Arguments over who was the bravest, who had the most scars, or who had saved whom were settled with fists or sometimes spears. It was a pressure cooker. It released the tension of battle, but it also reinforced the hierarchy. You had to hold your wine just as you held your line. The competition of arete. The internal culture of the Hetairoi was toxic with competition. They were constantly vying for Alexander's favor. If Alexander charged, you had to charge faster. If he took a wound, you had to take two. This created a dangerous dynamic known as heroic recklessness. Companions would take suicidal risks just to be seen doing it. They wore flashy cloaks, gold-plated armor, and plumed helmets, not just for protection, but for branding. They were the peacocks of death. The loot and the glory. By the time they reached Babylon, the companions were the richest soldiers in history. They drank from cups made of emeralds. They slept in tents captured from Persian kings. They wore purple robes, yet they still rode. The contrast between their unimaginable wealth and the brutal, muddy reality of their daily work created a strange psychological disconnect. They were billionaire butchers. The darkness, cruelty, mutiny, and the end of the brotherhood. We must not romanticize them. The companions were the enforcers of a megalomaniac's will, and as the campaign dragged on, the band of brothers began to eat itself. The burning of Persepolis. The darkest soul of the companions was revealed in Persepolis, the spiritual capital of Persia. After capturing the city, the army held a massive symposium. A courtesan named Thais, allegedly the lover of Ptolemy, suggested they burn the great palace to avenge the burning of Athens 150 years prior. Alexander, drunk and ecstatic, agreed. The companions formed a procession, waving torches, singing songs, and dancing. They marched into the most magnificent palace on earth, a repository of art, literature, and history. They set it on fire. They stood and cheered as centuries of culture turned to ash. It was an act of cultural genocide, fueled by alcohol
and the arrogance of total victory. It proved that the Hetairoi were not liberators, they were conquerors in the most brutal sense. The purge of Philotas. As Alexander pushed deeper into Asia, he began to adopt Persian customs. He wore the diadem. He demanded proskynesis, ritual bowing. The older companions, the men who knew him as a boy, hated this. They felt he was becoming a tyrant. Philotas, the commander of the companion cavalry and the son of Parmenion, Alexander's chief general, grew critical. When a plot to kill Alexander was uncovered, Philotas was accused of knowing about it and staying silent. The reaction of the brotherhood was chilling. They did not defend their commander. They turned on him. In a show trial before the army, the other companions accused Philotas of arrogance. They tore him down to save themselves. Philotas was tortured for days. Then the companions, his friends, his messmates, stoned him to death. Alexander then sent assassins to Media to murder Philotas's father, Parmenion. The message was clear. The brotherhood serves the king. If you are not with the king, you are meat. The trust was broken. The band of brothers was now a court of survivors. The Gedrosian horror. The final defeat of the companions was not in battle, but by nature. On the return march from India, Alexander chose to cross the Gedrosian desert, modern Baluchistan. It was a desolate wasteland. The army ran out of water. The heat was blistering. The sand was like powder, making walking impossible. Here the proud Hetairoi were reduced to animals. The horses, the Thessalian beasts they had groomed, named, and loved, began to die of thirst. The men were forced to do the unthinkable. They slaughtered their own mounts. They drank the blood of their horses to survive. The unit that entered the desert was a golden wedge of conquerors. The unit that crawled out 60 days later was a group of haggard, traumatized ghosts. They had eaten the source of their power.
The legacy. The silence after the thunder. Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BC. He was 32 years old. With his last breath, he allegedly left his empire to the strongest. The companions immediately drew their swords on one another. The cohesion that had conquered the world evaporated in seconds. Ptolemy took Egypt, Seleucus took Babylon, Lysimachus took Thrace. They spent the next 40 years fighting the wars of the Diadochi, the successors. The Hetairoi fought Hetairoi. The brotherhood died with the king. Why we still fear them? But the mark they left in history is indelible. The Macedonian companion cavalry changed the DNA of warfare forever. They proved that technology plus psychology equals victory. They showed that a small, highly trained, cohesive unit could shatter an army 10 times its size if applied with surgical precision. They were the ancestors of every elite unit that followed, from Napoleon's cuirassiers to the modern tank division.
They taught the world that the most dangerous weapon is not the spear nor the sword. It is the momentum. It is the terrifying sight of a wedge of men who do not fear death, riding as one, thundering toward a gap in the line. The final image. Close your eyes and listen one last time. The year is 326 BC. The rain is falling on the banks of the Hydaspes. The mud is deep, but through the rain you see them. The bronze helmets gleaming, the sarissas lowered, the steam rising from the flanks of the black horses. Alexander raises his ziston. The roar begins, and for one brief, violent moment, the world belongs to them.
A note on strategy for the modern reader. The companions operated on a principle that is still taught in military academies and business schools today: concentration of force. They did not try to be strong everywhere. They accepted weakness on their left flank. They accepted being outnumbered in the center. They concentrated 100% of their elite power into 10% of the battlefield. They found the critical point, the gap, the king, the weak link, and they applied maximum pressure to that single point until it broke. Once the critical point shattered, the rest of the system collapsed. Whether in war, business, or art, the lesson of the Hetairoi remains. Find the gap, form the wedge, and don't stop until you are through.